This is your host, Danny, and this is Education Plus, a podcast by Plus Podcast Network. Subscribe to Plus Podcast Network and have access to all our premium shows. You have two ways to do that. If you have access to Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe directly from Apple Podcasts and have easy access to all our shows, both free and premium, in one place. If you don't have access to Apple Podcasts, you can become our patron on Patreon, and then you will have access to all the same premium podcasts on our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. Now, you can find the links in the description of this episode, so you can go there, subscribe, and enjoy all the shows in Plus Podcast Network. In our very first episode, I have decided to talk about podcasting itself. And I know that this is not about podcasting, this is about education. So actually, the people who are interested in this, maybe teachers, educators in any kind of business, maybe you are a trainer, maybe a business trainer, it doesn't matter. But education has kind of the same things that apply to almost everything where teaching is involved. Now, sometimes that doesn't mean teaching at school. Maybe you want to teach something to your colleague, or maybe you're a manager and you want to teach this person something. So teaching is actually everywhere. Education is everywhere. But I will have to say that our podcast is geared more towards educators in general, but the concepts we talk about here, the things we talk about here are good for anyone who might need to teach something to someone. And trust me, you're going to teach something one day to someone, whether that's your son or daughter at home or your colleague at work. So now, without further ado, let's start talking about podcasting. Now, let me start by telling you what I'm going to be talking about in this podcast. Now, this episode is going to be divided into three main parts. The first part is planning, the second part is production, and the third part is publishing and distribution. Now, in planning, I'm going to start with the very obvious questions. What are podcasts? Because as simple as that might seem, it is not that simple for a lot of people. Or at least that can cause confusion in the minds of some people. They think podcast is something and it is not. So I'm just going to talk in a nutshell what podcasts are and why podcasting. Why would you want to start a podcast? Then we will talk about some important things you need to think about when you are in the planning phase of your podcast. And that is like, who is your ideal listener? We will talk about SEO-friendly titles and descriptions, the format and length of your podcast, the podcast graphic, and the podcast music. Then we will move on to talk about production. I will talk in brief about the recording equipment you need, the software, some myths that go around this. For example, that you need thousands of dollars to start podcasting, and that is so not true. And then I'm going to talk about some other basics that you need to know about production. And I will give you a couple of tips that you can use for recording, editing, mixing, and mastering. And then finally, we will talk about publishing and distribution. In publishing and distribution, I'm going to talk to you about hosting services, the metadata, website, analytics, and podcast directories. And also, I almost forgot that we're also going to talk about promotion. Talking about promotion, we will talk about CTA, social media, monetization, and podcast launching. And finally, I will finish with some lessons learned from English Plus, my first podcast, which is in a good place now, but it wasn't always the case, and I made some mistakes along the way that I wouldn't want you to make. So I will discuss all that with you. So there's a lot to talk about. Let's not waste any more time, and let's start talking about podcast planning. So let's start with the very first question. What are podcasts? What is a podcast? And now you come to think about it, and you tell yourself, yeah, this is something that I watch on YouTube. Well, if you think about podcasts this way, let me tell you that I'm talking about audio podcasts. More interested in video podcasts, I'll have to be sorry, but at least this time, I'm not going to be talking about video podcasts. So, what are podcasts? The podcasts we're talking about something like on-demand radio station. Now, we all know radio stations. Maybe you listen to some radio stations, maybe you don't. But the radio station has a program. And if you miss the show, you might catch up the show later because they rerun the show at a later time, and you might not. And if you don't catch the show when it is broadcasted live or when they rerun the show, you lose the show forever. But that's not the case with podcasts. Podcasts are like on-demand radio stations. You can listen to any episode from your favorite podcasts anytime you like. So that makes it a lot more convenient. So that is one positive thing when you think about podcasts. But that is the technical thing. What are podcasts? But what are podcasts in essence? The essence of podcasts that these are informal and intimate ways to connect with people. Maybe you are connecting with customers. In our case, Education Plus, you are connecting with your students. Maybe you're connecting with your colleagues, as we said. Maybe you are teaching your colleagues. Maybe you are a corporate trainer and you create a podcast to communicate with the employees of your company or a company that you're training. I don't know. But you are connecting with these people in an informal way. Don't get me wrong, that doesn't mean that there are no formal podcasts. Yes, there are some formal podcasts, but podcasts in essence, if you listen to podcasts, if you haven't listened to podcasts before and this is your first time, you will see that podcasts are not formal. And that is a big advantage because you are talking to people and you are in their ears, because usually people listen to their podcasts and they use headphones or earphones. So it's like you're whispering in their ears. It is that intimate. And it is informal because it is like a radio station, and radio stations are not usually formal. And that's even less formal than radio stations. Podcasts are informal and intimate. So you have to put that in mind when you are planning. Remember, we're talking about this because that will help you plan your podcast. And then podcasts are usually specific and niche or niche, whatever you want to call it. Some people say niche, some people say niche. Just pick the pronunciation you like. But podcasts are not usually general and talk about everything. For example, you are listening now to Education Plus. In Education Plus, we don't talk about podcasting for teachers this time, and next time we talk about nuclear physics. It doesn't work this way. Usually, you pick one topic and you stick to this topic. Now, how specific you should go, that's up to you, but it should be specific. And that's what categories are made for. And we will talk about categories later in this episode, but from the get-go, you need to understand that podcasts are specific and niche. Not all of them are niche, but if you have a niche podcast, that means you're not going to get millions of listeners, maybe, but you're going to get quality listeners who are interested in what you have to say. And quality listeners are more important than just very large number of listeners who are not specifically interested in your niche or in you or in your podcast. So in a nutshell, that is what podcasts are. They're on-demand radio station, informal and intimate. They're specific and niche. And now we come to the next question. Why podcasting? Why podcasting? Well, if you think about it, because it's intimate. It's one of the things why we want to podcast. We want to be heard. And we just don't want to be lost in a vacuum. Or, I'm not saying YouTube is bad. Don't get me wrong. YouTube is perfect. But YouTube is not intimate in any way. And if you really want to get this kind of intimate connection with your listeners, podcasting is number one. Remember, I said that earlier. You're like whispering in their ears. They are listening to you and nobody else is listening to what you're saying but the person who's listening to you. That is precious. So, because they're intimate, but that's not everything. That we don't just podcast because podcasting is intimate. We podcast because podcasting is free. And I'm not talking about money here because podcasting obviously can be free, and I will talk about that later. But it is preferable that you invest a little bit to have a better quality podcast. But that later. We're talking about free. That is the freedom of speech. You can talk about anything you want. Even if you want to talk about things that are not suitable for children, you can mark your podcast as not suitable for children and you can podcast about whatever you want. So it is a free medium of expression. You can express yourself in any way you want. And you can talk about any topic you want. And if you want to think about other reasons why we should podcast, because it's a strong platform. Because as time goes by and you build your audience and you have loyal listeners, you will have an authority that you wouldn't have that easily on other platforms. I mean, I'll give you a quick comparison. If you have 100 loyal listeners on your podcast, that is much better than 10,000 subscribers on YouTube. I'm not talking about money yet. Maybe money is better, maybe money is not. That's not the point. But if you want to get to these people, and in the context of education, maybe making money is not the first thing why you started the podcast, but you want to build this strong connection and you want to display yourself as an authoritative voice, and that can be done by podcasting. And of course, there is the reason of making money. You can make money podcasting, and that is or can be one of the most important reasons why you choose to podcast, whether you're a teacher or not. Even when you teach, you can still teach, you can still talk about the things you love and the things you're passionate about. Teach your passion to the world, share your passion with the world, and make money along the way. That's not bad at all. Now, later in this episode, I will talk about common ways podcasters make money. Now that we have a main idea what podcasting is and what it is about, let's start planning our podcast. When you start planning your podcast, the very first question you need to ask, and the most important question, who is your ideal listener? So, who is your ideal listener? Now, some people start thinking about this question the wrong way. When they start thinking about who the ideal listener is, they start thinking about what people want. And that's not a bad thing to think about, of course, especially in the world of marketing. But it is not about people yet. It will be. Definitely, it will be. Podcasting or anything you give to people is about people. It's not just about you. But think first about yourself. Everything starts with you. Ask yourself the following questions. What are you passionate about? What truly moves you? What problem are you trying to solve? Answer these first, and then knowing your ideal listener will be a lot easy. But you might ask, what does that have to do with my ideal listener? Well, first of all, let me tell you why these questions are important. If you know what you're passionate about, this thing will get to people. People will feel your passion. They will get it. It is an intangible thing that it is out there. If you're passionate about something, when you talk about it, this passion will transfer to the ears and minds of the people who are listening to you. And that is definitely one of the things that you can beat any other podcaster who's talking about the same thing and maybe has better equipment, better quality, better everything, but doesn't have the same passion you have. And here, as you notice, I'm not talking about expertise. Of course, expertise is important. You wouldn't want to talk about something you have no idea about. Because imagine if somebody asks, and people are not stupid. Listeners are not stupid. No matter how old they are, they will figure it out that you have no idea about what you're talking about. So being an expert or being a knowledgeable person about what you're talking about, that is a given. But being passionate is what matters. Being passionate, because that will guarantee that you will not stop. And I will talk more about that later, because one of the most common problems of any podcast is just begin with 1 or 2 episodes and then stop. And that has happened over and over and over. And that almost happened to me at the beginning of my podcast, English Plus. But the only thing that helped me continue is not the money. Because, to be honest, I didn't make a lot of money. I still don't make a lot of money out of my podcasts, but because of the passion I have. Because of the passion. I'm passionate about these things. I want to tell people about these things. Whether it's English Plus or Education Plus or Fiction Plus or any of the other podcasts in Plus Podcast Network, I'm just passionate about these things. You know what? Even if I tell you these things and nobody listens to them, I would like to listen to that stuff. I enjoy the whole process of preparing the episode, learning more, because not everything. I don't know everything I talk about all the time. Sometimes I need to research, learn new stuff. I am interested. I'm actually passionate about the things I learn every time I record a new episode. So that is just crazy. And that is the first reason that gives you consistency. So you see what I mean? Before you think about your ideal listener, think about yourself. Because to start right, you start with yourself, you know where your passions lie, and then you know the topic that you can talk about on and on forever without ever getting bored. And then it will be easy to know who your ideal listener is. Who would want to listen to something like that? But first, I guarantee that I'm not going to stop. I'm not going to stop anytime soon. That's why I started with these 3 questions. What are you passionate about? What truly moves you? And what problem are you trying to solve? And the third question is a little bit technical and a little bit more marketing oriented. Because yes, you might be passionate about something and you have something that really moves you and you would love to talk about this all the time. And now just to mention something about podcasting, why podcasting is cool, because sometimes you are crazy about things and you would want to talk to people about these things all the time. But you know, people have different interests. Your friends, your family, they have different interests. They might listen to you a couple of times, but then you can't talk all the time about what you're passionate about. You need to listen to them as well. But in podcasting, you can. You can talk about that because people, your ideal listeners, are going to be as passionate as you are, and they're going to love listening to you every single time. And you can talk about it anytime you want. That's priceless, to be honest. Anyway, let's continue with the question, what problem are you trying to solve? Because sometimes passion alone is not enough. Passion is great. But if I listen to an episode from beginning to end, and at the end of the episode, maybe I had a good time, maybe I was entertained, and that's great. If this is the purpose, that's perfect. But remember, we're talking about podcasting for teachers and educators or trainers. So there needs to be a problem that you are trying to solve. Whatever that problem may be, but you need to have a focus. You need to add this value to your podcast. So what problem are you trying to solve? If you answer these questions first, then you can check the podcast directories, because I've seen it many times that people go to the podcast directories, to Apple Podcasts or to your podcast host, and you check the categories that you have. You check the categories and you see that, yes, we have books, we have arts, we have society and culture, education, etc. So I'm going to pick one of the categories because I think this category is trending. Please forget about what's trending. Your podcast may be the next big hit. Don't underestimate what you can do. Don't look for what other people are doing and try to do the same, because that will definitely be bland and nobody would want to listen to your podcast. Just try to do your own thing. And after you answer these questions, then you look at the categories and you see, yes, I'm going to talk about this, I'm going to talk about that, I'm passionate about this, I'm passionate about that. So it is easy for me now to pick a category, and you will. But that, of course, doesn't answer the first big question that we ask, and that is, who is your ideal listener? Well, who is your ideal listener? As I said, first start with yourself, but then, of course, you have to think about your ideal listener. And some people here might go like, who cares who my ideal listener is? Well, you do, not because you are talking to one person and one person only, but because to ensure that you have this consistency in your podcast, and consistency is something that is very important to any form of communication. Doesn't mean that you say the same things over and over, but you are talking in a consistent voice. When people get used to listening to you, they will want to lean on something they are used to. And here, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about boring and routine. No, not at all. I'm just talking about a consistent voice. Think about big talk show hosts. They have this consistent voice. That's why we listen or watch their shows. So it is important. And how can we achieve this is when we think about our ideal listener and we start developing what we call ideal listener persona. Now, ideal listener persona, you might think that, yeah, I have like 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 potential personas that I am going to talk to. That is my ideal listener, or in this case, I should say these are my ideal listeners. But the problem is that here your consistency will suffer, because every time you're talking to a different person. Now, that is okay if you're doing interviews, of course, but if you are talking like I'm talking to you right now, well, do I know who is listening at this very moment to the show? I have absolutely no idea, but I have a persona in mind, and actually I have a picture for that person in mind. I'm not going to tell you if it's a man or a woman, but I have a picture of this person, and I ask myself a question before I start any podcast. What is their age? I'm talking about the listener persona. What is their age, gender, likes and dislikes? I kind of write something like a description of this character, like if you were writing a story or a novel. You write a description of the character, and this listener persona is a character. What is their age, gender, likes and dislikes? Where do they hang out online? Where do they shop? If you're interested in selling things, you would want to ask this question to yourself. What career do they have? Now, in our case here, because we're talking about podcasting for educators and teachers, you might think students, but not all the times, because remember, I told you, you could be a trainer. You could use the information we're talking about today if you are a trainer. And trainers, they have all kinds of people who they train in companies. So ask these questions. When you come up with answers, you will have a description of this person, of this listener persona, and maybe you will attach a picture, any picture, online picture. You just pick a picture that represents this person you just described and put this picture in front of you. It helps. Put this picture in front of you, and when you record the first and second and 10th and 100th episode, think about this person, think that you are talking to this person, and you will have a consistent voice every time. This is not a trick. This is standard procedure in marketing. All marketing people know about that, know what I'm talking about. They know the persona. Of course, for them, they might have different reasons why they would want to create this persona, but for us, we are talking about listener persona. So it is very important to start with yourself first, but then ask these questions. What is the age, gender, likes, and dislikes of my listener, of my ideal listener? Where does he or she hang out online? Where does he or she shop? And what career do they have? When you answer these questions, you will have your ideal listener and you will have the consistent voice you need when you want to start a podcast. And now, that is about who is your ideal listener. Let's move on to talk about the next point, and that is SEO-friendly title and description. Now that we know who our ideal listener is, it's time to start thinking about our title and description. And that's next. So we will talk about SEO-friendly title and description. Now, for those of you who have no idea what SEO stands for, it stands for Search Engine Optimization. And when we talk about search engine optimization, anything, SEO, that is simply how to make Google happy. Now, I said Google because Google is the biggest search engine in the world, but that works as well for others like Ask.com, Bing.com, or if you live in China, for example, there's Baidu, etc. But SEO, that is how to optimize the titles, the descriptions that you have so that you can show in the search results on Google. And here we're talking about organic search results. I'm not talking about ads. And I won't talk about ads. Ads can be a good way, of course, to start promoting your podcast, but I'm not going to be talking about this. I'm just going to talk about SEO friendly. And we're not going technical. This thing can get really technical, but I'm going to focus on a couple of things. First of all, what can listeners search for? Because when you know what listeners can search for on podcast listening apps, you will know that these things are important for you to know so that you can create better or SEO-friendly titles. First of all, the show title. The show title is definitely SEO searchable because people can search for titles, can search for something, and then the results come back, and the first thing that pops up is the show title. And then we have episode titles. These are also very important. But when we talk about episode titles, there is room or there is a margin for error here because if you don't really nail it the first time, well, you have other episodes, but the show title is very important. And that's why I'm going to talk about it in more detail. But again, the two things that you really need to give careful thought of your titles, especially we're talking about titles here, is the show title and the episode title. The show title is more important, of course, because you can't just change it anytime you want. But the episode titles, that's fine. Next episode, you're going to create a better SEO-friendly title. So, what about other things? What about the author field? Well, the author field is searchable, but unless you are a celebrity and people are searching for your name, it's not going to show. But it is there. And then we have other things. We have the description of episodes. Some people say it's very important and you need to make SEO-friendly descriptions. Yeah, that is important. The description is important for people who want to know what your episode is about. Or, of course, what your show is about, but these are not searchable on podcast listening services. Now, when we talk about your website, that's a different story. On your website, of course, all of these things are searchable by Google. But I'm talking about if you go, for example, to Apple Podcasts and search for something, the description is not searchable. So it's not going to make any difference, but it is going to make a big difference that you write a good description of the episode because people might look at the description, might read the description first before they decide to listen to your show or to your episode. So write good descriptions, but SEO is not a big deal in descriptions. And as I told you, I'm going to focus a little bit more on show titles because these are very important and it is not a good idea to change your show title. Maybe you can, and it's not a big deal, especially if your show evolves into something else or something like that. But there is always a big risk of losing people. And once you start podcasting, you will know that it is not that simple to have listeners, to have loyal listeners and to grow your audience. It takes a lot of work and you wouldn't want to lose your audience just like that because you want to change the title. So from the get-go, try to think about a good title. Now, you know what you're going to talk about, you know your listener persona, everything. So now you want to decide what your show title should be. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples, and maybe I want to start a show that talks about translation, and I'm going to talk about some tips and tricks in translation. So it's like I'm giving you some insider information, maybe secrets or something. So I might go with translation secrets. Well, I know this is kind of generic, but it serves the purpose because it is SEO friendly. If people are looking for translation podcasts or podcasts that talk about translation, there's a good chance that my podcast is going to show up in the search results. So that is a good. But the way I think about it, that in show titles, we have the good, the vague, and the ugly. Now, this is the good, but the vague is like when you say, my podcast title is going to be From A to B. Wow, from A to B, that's huge. What do you mean, from A to B? Well, in your mind, it might be clear. From A to B, I mean that you're going to take something from one language to another. So that is A and that is B. Well, you know about that. I don't. The listeners don't. People in general don't. We don't know what you might be thinking about. We know what we can see. Maybe later, yes, we will understand the way you think and everything, and we will appreciate the subtlety of From A to B. But from the get-go, your podcast is new. Nobody is going to understand. This is vague. When I see a podcast that is titled From A to B, I have absolutely no idea what it is about. Maybe if I have time and I'm that curious, I will listen to a couple of episodes and then, this podcast is about this or about that. But I will never figure it out just from reading the title or just seeing the title. So don't go for the vague unless you really want this. But I can't imagine why you would want something like that. So we talked about the good, like translation secrets. Very simple, very straightforward, not creative at all, but it is good. It serves the purpose, and especially here we're talking about SEO-friendly titles, right? And then there's the vague, From A to B. Let's talk about the ugly. Well, for the same podcast, I'm still talking about translation, and I'm still talking about tips and tricks in translation and stuff like that, and I decided to call it Danny's World. Well, that is ugly. That is really ugly. What does that mean? Who is Danny? Who cares about Danny? Well, I care. I am Danny, of course, but people don't. People don't know who you are, and they don't just want to go to your world. It's not Token's world. It's not Middle Earth, for God's sake. It is Danny's world. So that is definitely an ugly podcast, especially if you're not a celebrity. Of course, don't get me wrong. If you get a podcast and it's named Brad Pitt's World, of course, it's going to attract a lot of people. But we're talking about podcasts for us first before we become celebrities. When we become celebrities, when you become celebrities, I hope you do, you can name your podcast whatever you want. You just say that this is my podcast, this is the official podcast of whatever your celebrity name is, and you're going to have millions of listeners. That's not a problem. But remember, we're still talking about podcasting for teachers, right? So mostly we're not celebrities yet, and so we wouldn't want to use a name that is just like that, Danny's World. First of all, it is not related to translation, and second of all, as I told you, nobody cares about me. They don't know me yet. So just keep that in mind. But again, there's nothing right and wrong about that. It's your choice. Sometimes people come up with the weirdest titles and it works, but most of the times it doesn't. And if you want to stay safe, SEO friendly, you can take my advice into consideration. And one more thing before we move on and talk about the format and length of your episodes, when it comes to SEO friendly, whether we're talking about the title or description, you're going to be using keywords, and that's okay, but don't overdo it. For the show title, for the episode title, for the description, don't overdo it. That's very important. And here, what I'm talking about, if your title is translation and translation is your keyword, for example, and you think about a very clever way of ranking up in search results, and in the description you mentioned the word translation like 10 or 12 or 100 times, that's definitely bad. And search engines are not as stupid as they used to be 15 years ago. They're very clever. They know exactly that you are overusing the keywords, and they're not gonna like it, to be honest. So use keywords, but don't overuse keywords. Don't overdo it. And with that being said, let's move on to talk about the format and length of your episodes. So let's start talking about the format. It's a very important question to ask yourself. Remember, we're still in the planning phase. The question is, what is the best format for my episode? Well, of course, that depends on what you want to say and how important it is and who you're talking to, because it is different, of course. When you're talking to people who are busy and they don't have a lot of time, that's your listener persona. You see why it is important to identify a listener persona, because you would know that this person would listen to 5 minutes to 10 minutes, more, less, etc. And that will help you decide how long and the format of your podcast in general. But let's talk about some common formats that you can find every day in the world of podcasting. You have the solo show. A solo show is just like Education Plus and like most of my podcasts. You can do that when you have the passion to talk about something and when you have the expertise to talk about something, because these two things are identifiable and people can relate to them. People can guess if you are passionate or not, and can guess if you know what you're talking about or not. So if you have passion for something, and especially remember for teachers, they usually have a passion for a certain topic, and even for trainers, they have a passion and they try to share this passion with other people. So if you have this passion, you're an expert, you know what you're talking about, you might go for a solo show. You're the host and you're the only person who talks in your episodes. Or you might want to use interviews. Maybe you want to mix a solo show with some interviews along the way. That works too. But you might choose an interview format for your podcast, and that is helpful for driving traffic. I'll be honest with you, solo shows are not great for driving traffic, especially at the beginning. Well, as time goes by and you are consistent, you will drive the traffic you deserve. But at the beginning, it's a little bit difficult. But when you interview, the people you are interviewing will be helping you market the podcast. Interviews are great, but they can take a little bit more time for planning, for making appointments for the interviews. Sometimes the logistics are not that easy if people do not live in the same place where you live, and there's going to be some more problems about recording. You're not going to have the same quality every time because not everybody has the same microphone you have and the same setup that you have. So you have to consider these things before you decide to go for interviews. And let me say, I'm not trying to advise you against going for interviews. Interviews are great. And not because my podcasts are all solo shows, I don't want you to do anything else. No, definitely not. Solo shows are great. They work for me. They might not work for you, or you might prefer interviews. Remember, interviews, there's a good thing about it. It drives more traffic, especially at the beginning. But the not bad, I'm going to say the negative, or the thing that you have to consider when you want to start a podcast and the format of the podcast is interviews, that it is not that straightforward logistically. And then you might have group discussions. You might have discussions about certain topics, and in the world of education, that is very common. And you might record this discussion. You might just have your students or a group of employees you're training, and you discuss a certain topic, you record it, and then you put it in the podcast. That is great. And that is even better, driving traffic, a lot better than the interviews as well. But again, you need to have access to this group, because remember, you need to be consistent. You cannot just post one episode and then you just don't post anything for 2 months and then post 2 episodes in a week and then you just disappear for a couple of months. You need to make sure that you have regular access to this group or any other group you're forming to create those episodes. But if you have that access, that's really awesome. Of course, the logistics are not as simple again as the solo show or even the interview, because you might need more mics, you might need a bigger place to record, etc. But if you can do that, if you can pull that off, that will be perfect. Or you can have something, a format that is also common, that is we call the listener engagement, where you engage with your listeners in a question and answer format or Ask Me Anything podcast. And that is also perfect for teachers and educators. Because for teachers, educators, you might just go for a podcast where students send you questions, maybe in audio format, and then you just play this question and answer. It doesn't have to be live. You don't have to be with them in the same room or, recording at the same time. That is good for interviews or for group discussions. But for listener engagement, you might ask your students to send you questions in audio format, and that's very easy. You can tell them to record their questions on their mobile phones, and then they can send it to you, and the quality will be perfect. And then you can play these questions and answer. Or you can make it live. You can go for live podcasting, and that's also cool. But the format is question and answer, or AMA, Ask Me Anything. Ask Me Anything, that is usually live, because people show, or in your case might be your students, again, employees you're training, they might show up and ask you anything. And here, you need to make sure that you really know what you're talking about. And in the case of teaching, of course you know what you're talking about, you're teaching it. So you have the answers. It's just like anywhere else. If people ask you in a classroom or in a training, you're going to answer them, right? you're going to have a way to answer them. So if you can do that, you can do it live. It takes a little bit practice if you're going to do it live, but you can do the listener engagement format, and that is also great for driving traffic. So the formats, again, you can go for solo show, interviews, group discussions, or listener engagement. Now we talked about the format, let's talk about the length. And the length, I will just talk about two things, not only the length, the frequency and the length of the episode. Now, we know the format of the whole podcast or the whole show, fine. But what about the length of the episode? How long should the episode be and how frequently should I post? Should I post every week, every day, every month? How short or how long should the episode be? What is the X formula? What is the secret formula for success? Well, I'm sorry, but I don't have that formula because I would have used it myself and I would have told you about it. But that doesn't mean that I didn't struggle with that at the beginning. At the beginning, I read a lot of articles and listened to a lot of people, and people just kind of disagreed about that big time. Some people said half an hour for the episode is perfect. Some people said you need to podcast every day. Some people said don't ever podcast every day. Just podcast once a week. If you podcast every day, you're not going to get any listeners. Some people said you shouldn't go over 20 minutes per episode because people don't listen to you anymore after 20 minutes. And, they have a point. All these different opinions, they all have a point. But the real secret behind all that it should be as long as you can keep the episode interesting and useful. And in the case of training or teaching, of course, you wouldn't want to go on and on for hours in one episode. But again, deciding on the length, that should go with how interesting. You should be honest with yourself. You should ask yourself, is it still interesting? Am I still interested after half an hour, after 45 minutes, after 2 hours? Now, for me, I'm talking about podcasting, and we're in the first part where we're going to talk about planning, and next time we're going to talk about the other parts. Because, just if I want to talk about all of them, the episode is going to be like 3 hours long. So I kind of divided the episode, but even this episode is long. And some people might not find it interesting, but you know what? The persona that I have in mind will find it interesting, hopefully, will find it interesting, will find it useful, and they will keep on listening to the end of the episode. So that is the formula for me. For some other episodes, I have a podcast that's called Expressions Plus, and the length of the episode is about 1 to 3 minutes max. Some other episodes, I have like 1 hour. In Documentary Plus, for example, I have 1 hour, 1 hour and a half for the episode. For English Plus, it's usually around 15 to 20 minutes, but it's not about what's better, what's not. Of course, you wouldn't want to drag on and on forever, but at the same time, as long as you're saying something, as long as you're adding value, and you try to keep the podcast interesting, and by the way, there's a very easy hack to keep the podcast interesting. If you're passionate about it, if you're passionate about what you're saying, you will be interesting, and people will be interested because you're passionate, not because you're just like reading it from a paper and you just can't wait until this ends. And guess what? Your listeners are going to feel the same way. And they're actually not going to wait for you until you finish. They're going to finish you long before you do. So, coming back to the length and frequency. Now, the frequency, again, that's up to you to decide, but you have to be as consistent as possible. If you decide on once a week, think about what is doable, what is feasible for you. If you can produce one episode every week, just go for it. But make sure that you really can produce one episode every week. You wouldn't want to just disappear for a couple of weeks and then come back. If you think you can't, no problem. Just do it every other week. That's okay. And people will get used to it. And then, of course, there is a kind of a relation or a correlation between length and frequency. So for example, if your podcast is daily, usually you wouldn't want to go for a very long podcast, first of all, because it takes a lot of time to produce. And the second thing is that nobody is going to listen to 7 hours of your podcast every week. That's too much. Imagine 1 hour every day. That's too much. Now, as I told you earlier, some of my podcasts or some of my episodes are 1 hour long, but these are weekly podcasts. Now, for the others, the shorter ones, these are daily. I can go for daily podcasts or daily episodes when the episode is not too long. But again, remember, the secret formula of success when it comes to frequency and length, just make it as feasible as possible so that you can ensure consistency, whether it's weekly, whether it's every other week, whether it's daily, monthly, whatever. But I will have to say weekly is the best. Weekly is the best. If you really think you can pull that off, that's great. But if you can't, no problem at all. Every 2 weeks is fine. Now, every month, it's a little bit on the low frequency side, but if you really can't produce more than one episode every month, no problem. Who am I to judge you? Of course, go ahead and do it because you will be consistent this way. Anyway, so that is about the format and length. Now, we still have a couple of things to talk about before we finish today's episode, and that is about the podcast graphic and the podcast music. So let's talk about these next. So when it comes to the podcast graphic, you will want to go for what Apple wants because Apple is the biggest player in the market. It's the biggest player in the world of podcasting. And especially now, they've just released the Podcast Creator Program and they're just getting bigger. But anyway, even before the Creator Program, they are the biggest player in the market. And if you're wondering, the second biggest player is Spotify. But that's not the point. The point is you would want to consider what Apple wants when it comes to podcast graphic. They ask for at least 1400 by 1400 pixels, but you can go up to 3000 pixels. And it's going to be square, of course, so 3000 by 3000, and go for 3000 by 3000. Now, in the new Creator Program, they actually asked for 3000 by 3000 exclusively. They don't accept it if it's not 3000 by 3000. So just make it 3000 by 3000. And the good news, why am I saying what Apple wants? Because what Apple wants works for everybody else. But it's not the same the other way around. And you will have to know something else. And I know this is technical, but this is important because you wouldn't want your submission to be rejected just because of these stupid things. So go for 3000 by 3000 pixels. And for the DPI, and that is something that you can look for in whatever application you're using to create this podcast graphic of yours, you will have to set the DPI to 72. Because it's not usually the case. For example, in Photoshop, it's usually 150 by default. So you will have to set it to 72 for this podcast graphic specifically because Apple wants it to be 72 DPI. And of course, something that you need to know, and it's just common sense. Steer clear from profanity, steer clear from sexual content, from anything that has a hint to discrimination of any kind, because these are not acceptable at all. And don't get me wrong, you might want to talk about something sexual in nature. You might want to talk about sex education. Fine, that's your right, and there's nothing wrong about that. But you don't need to put a picture of what you're going to teach in the podcast graphic. Even if you're going to teach about that, there is no need, to be honest, to put it in the podcast graphic, so don't. There is no need to do that. And I know that this is a rare case and most of us are going to teach or going to talk about different things. And I can go on and on about the things that are acceptable and not acceptable. Or the easiest thing is to search for what Apple expects from you in the podcast graphic. What is acceptable, what is not acceptable. Now, for example, the things that are not acceptable, that you can't put a logo of something that you don't own, and definitely you cannot put anything that is related to Apple, the logo or anything that is related to Apple or Apple products, you can't put it on your podcast graphic. That's among the many things that you should think about or you should consider when you create your podcast graphic. But again, you can read that online, you can search for it. Now, Apple aside, what best practices you should think about when you want to create your podcast graphic? First of all, you need to be consistent with your brand. You might say, what is my brand? I don't have a company. Fine, your brand is you, your name. Your name is your brand. You are the brand. So if you don't have a company, that doesn't mean that you don't have a brand. You are a brand. Because you are a brand, whatever your brand is, you need to think about colors. You need to be consistent with these colors. There is a font type that you should keep consistent because people will start recognizing the font type you use, the colors you use, and they will know that this is you after a while, of course, not from the first time. So that's why you need to be consistent because people need, according to some marketing research, people need 5 to 7 or 8 impressions before they can start remembering you. So they need to see you or to see your brand 5 to 7 times before they start remembering you. So if every time you show up in a different color, not you, of course, you can wear whatever you want, but you show up in a different color in the podcast graphic, a different font or something like that, people will definitely not remember you because they will think you're somebody else. So be consistent with your brand, use one font type, and it is very important when you create this podcast graphic to look at the podcast graphic in a thumbnail size and a very small thumbnail size, because guess what? Most people are going to see this graphic that you created on their mobile phones, and it's not going to cover the whole screen. It's just going to cover a very small part of the screen inside the podcast player. So think about that. Your podcast graphic needs to be good at this small size. I'm telling you that because honestly, a lot of people make this mistake, including myself, because when we design something, we design it on a big screen. Maybe you bought yourself a very big screen at home and you're very happy about it because you can see things very clearly and 4K or 8K or whatever K you have. But the idea is when you see it on a big screen, yes, it's very good, but also try to see it on a very small screen, because that is where most people will see it. They will see it on their mobile phones, which are small, and it's going to cover a very small portion of the screen on the mobile phone. So it's going to be even smaller than the screen of the mobile phone. So always consider creating a readable podcast on small screens. So the thumbnail needs to be readable as well. And that brings me, of course, to a very good practice that you can think about, is that you shouldn't include a lot of words on your podcast graphic, because when it is small or when it shows on a small screen, it's not going to be readable. So don't put a lot of words, just put the words you really want people to see. And the picture that has a lot of vivid details might not be that great when you see it on a small screen. So think about that. Design first, of course, design to your heart's content on the biggest screen you have at home. But when you want to check your podcast graphic, check it on a small screen. See if it still looks good and if it is still readable. And if it is relevant, by all means, add your photo. A lot of people add their photos, and that's completely fine if it is relevant, and that is definitely your call. Now, for me, for example, I don't add my photo anywhere, but that's a personal choice. You can disagree with me. I might be wrong. Maybe I should have added my photo, maybe not, but I don't add my photo. You can add it if you think it's relevant. But if it is not relevant, and if it is not adding anything to the podcast graphic, don't add it, of course. And now one last thing before we finish this first part of our, I'm not going to call it series, but as I told you, the episode is going to be very long. So I kind of chopped it up into 3 or maybe 4 parts. It depends on how long the rest of the recording will take. But we focus today on starting a podcast, and this is the planning stage. So we're just planning the title, the podcast graphic, the frequency, the format, everything. And that is very important. You should know all these things before you start a podcast. And now one last thing we should know, or we should consider, is the show music. Now, when we want to talk about the show music, you will need music for your show, for your podcast. And this music can be transitions, the intros, the outros, the bed music like the background music, or you might need bumpers or sounders when it depends on what your podcast is about. You might have questions, you might have answers for Q&A, you might add it, but the least you need is intro music and outro music. Might be the same anyway, but you will need intro and outro, and you might need bed music based on what you're talking about, or if you think it's relevant. But the important thing is, don't make the mistake of thinking that you can take any piece of music and put it in your podcast, because guess what? Apple will figure that out, and almost everybody will know about that, and they will block your podcast from reaching anybody. They will tell you, of course, it's not that they're going to sue you. No, nobody's going to sue you, but that might cause interruption in the service, and people might not get your podcast until you just remove the music. And removing the music from many episodes is not that easy, especially if you don't have a lot of expertise in editing software and you just put everything together and now there's no way I can take away the music, so I need to record everything again. So just be safe from the very first beginning. Use music that you can get a license for. And when I talk about music that you can get a license for, you can get that from premiumbeat.com, audiojungle.com, audiohero.com. You can check these sites out. I'm not telling you to use any one of those. I'm not affiliated with them. But the point is, these sites will provide you with music you can license for your podcast, and you license it once and you can use it forever on as many podcasts or as many episodes as you want. So all you need is to choose the one that you like. You pay for it, and usually it's not very expensive. But to be honest, you're not buying the music, you're buying peace of mind because you have a license to use this music. And there's another common mistake when it comes to music, because I know that people do that. I've seen it before, and they were surprised when Apple contacted them and maybe not canceled, maybe just blocked their show because they have a music copyright violation. And they were like, that's impossible. All the music I've been using in my shows are Mozart's and Beethoven's and people who've been dead for more than 100 years. And the copyright law says that after you die, 75 years, your work becomes public domain, so anybody can use it, and that's true. But don't forget something that is very important. Yes, the music of Mozart, the music of Beethoven, of Bach, of those great composers is public domain. Anybody can use the music, but not the recordings. Those recordings you took from YouTube or whatever, those recordings were made 10 years ago, 5 years ago, maybe yesterday. So there are two kinds of copyright. There's the copyright of the music itself, which means you can take the music, you can perform the music yourself. If you can play, for example, if you can play any musical instrument and you perform this music, it's free. It's public domain, of course. You can play any piece of music if it is in the public domain and there's no problem. And the performance you record is yours, of course, and you can use it. But you cannot take Mozart or Chopin's or Beethoven's music and put it because it's public domain. The music is public domain, the recording, the performance is not. So there is your copyright infringement. So remember that, because that's very important. And don't think that it will never happen to me, because my podcast is new and nobody knows about it. Anyway, I'm going to have like 15 listeners or 30 listeners or 100. Well, if you're going to have 15 listeners or just 100 listeners, maybe nobody would care. But Apple might care even if you have one listener. You never know. And the other thing, what if your show catches fire and becomes viral? What are you going to do then? You're going to tell them, no, please don't go viral. I don't want more listeners. Come on. Everybody wants more listeners. But anyway, the bottom line is be safe. Go for these websites or any other website you like that sells licenses to use music, and you can use these pieces of music safely on your podcast. And now, with that being said, thank you very much for listening to this long episode. And that's not everything about podcasting. I told you at the beginning that we're going to talk about planning, production, publishing, and distribution and promotion. And we are going to talk about that. So today we've covered planning. Next time we're going to talk about production. Then we're going to talk about publishing, distribution, and promotion. Thank you very much for listening to Education Plus, a podcast by Plus Podcast Network. You can go ahead and check our podcast network. If you're listening to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe to the podcast network. We have premium shows and free shows in the channel Plus Podcast Network. You will get them all. And if you don't have Apple Podcasts and you would still like to subscribe to the premium shows, you can do that by becoming our patron on Patreon, and then you will have the same access to all the premium podcasts or premium shows, but on our website, EnglishPlusPodcast.com. You can listen to all of them on our website. With that being said, this is your host, Danny. Thank you again for listening to the episode. And don't forget, we'll meet again to continue talking about podcasting. I'll see you next time.